Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for your continued attention to this important topic. For those of the panelists that haven't been here since this morning, my name is Rochelle Garza. I'm the chair of the commission. I want to remind everyone that we have a licensed mental health professional available if you need assistance. So please let a staff member know. You can flag them down, and we can find a space for folks to speak with the counselor. Just some housekeeping matters. During the briefing panel, each panelist will have 7 minutes to speak. After each panel presentation, commissioners will have the opportunity to ask questions within the allotted period of time, and I will recognize commissioners who wish to speak. I will strictly enforce the time allotments given to each panelist to present his or her statement, and unless we did not receive your testimony until today, you may assume that we have read your testimony. So feel free to summarize it, and we will appreciate that so that you can make the best use of the 7 minutes allotted. So please focus your remarks on our briefing. Panelists, just want to draw your attention to the warning lights that have been set up in front of you. When the light turns from green to yellow, that means you have 2 minutes remaining. When the light turns red, panelists should conclude your statements so that you don't risk me cutting you off. I will let you finish your statement and your thought, but just try to wrap it up as quickly as you can. My fellow commissioners and I will do our part to keep our questions and comments concise. And we will now proceed with the third panel, individuals impacted by crime. In the order in which they will speak, our panelists are Nicole Neighbors, founder of Grace and Peace Counseling; Demetrius Molina, survivor of neighborhood violence; LaWanda Hawkins, founder of Justice for Murdered Children; Audacia Ray, director of Community Organizing and Advocacy Anti-Violence Project; Tashika Hillard, the widow of Deputy Glenn Hillard; Christina Love, survivor and executive director, Rural Alaska Integrated Services. So I want to thank you all for being here today and being willing to share your experience. Your willingness to speak to us today is going to play a critical role in taking steps to address crime in our country. So I want to say thank you very much. I know this is sensitive, and we are all eager to hear from you. So with that, I'm going to ask each of you to raise your right hand. I'm going to give you an oath. Will you swear and confirm that the information that you are about to provide us is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief? Thank you so much. So we'll go ahead and begin with Ms. Neighbors.
Thank you. My name is Nicole Neighbors. I was born in Niagara Falls, New York, and I'm the eldest child of 3. I grew up in Rochester, New York, and I attended School of the Arts for creative writing and drama. I was an all-city basketball player for 3 consecutive years. After high school, I joined the U.S. Navy. I served on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and I was an aviation bosun mate in crash and salvage. I served in Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Enduring Iraqi Freedom. After my service, I entered into community college for a year, and then I transitioned to seminary. But I was unable to complete my seminary course because in 2006, I was shot and left for dead after witnessing the gunman kill my cousin, Laniera Streeter. I called 911 and directed the authorities to my location. I did not know the physical address, so I used landmarks to navigate the authorities to me. It took over 20 minutes for them to get to me. Upon waking up in the hospital, I was told that I would never walk again. Doctors confirmed that I was shot in my neck, my torso, and my left leg. The bullet entered my torso, ricocheted off my internal organs, and lodged in the right side of my spine. That same bullet also collapsed my left lung. The doctors did not want to remove the bullet because they said it would cause more damage. The other shots are what they call through and through. The bullet went straight through my neck. The other one went through my leg. The bullet that went through my neck damaged my upper brachial plexus, which just means it affects the range of motion in my left arm. After being shot, I experienced quite a bit of rejection. My 25th birthday was exactly 1 month later, and both friends and family walked away. I stopped getting visits, phone calls went unanswered, and were not returned. I was also rejected by the healthcare system. But before I get into the details of that, I want to begin by saying that the surgical team saved my life. I was transported from Niagara Falls to Buffalo by Mercy flight and rushed into surgery, and I was revived twice. And so I will always be grateful to the staff who played a role in treating me. However, their bedside manners significantly differ from their medical skills. I experience prejudice and bias almost daily. Being a Black woman who suffered gunshot wounds meant I lived a particular lifestyle. Medical doctors would speak obscenities to me, saying things such as, "No more chilling with the homies," or "It's time for a lifestyle change." Sorry. You've been gifted with your life despite your past decisions. Now what are you going to do with it? I would also hear nurses from the hallway say, "Thugs get helped last," ignoring my call light. Two things were evident. The staff did not watch the news, and they believed that I had did something to deserve my circumstance. One by one, I educated them all. Most of the staff profusely apologized, but the problem is that they felt it was okay to behave in this manner in the first place. The biggest question that I have is, what if I was a thug? Would it mean that I deserved to hear slander from people who had dedicated their life to helping others heal? Can you imagine having these conversations, being in extreme pain and with difficulty breathing? Moreover, the impression of such remarks lasts much longer than the apologies. Mustering up the strength in my most broken state put me in a constant state of alert, in a place where I should have been able to rest. I was in the hospital for 4 months and 14 days. And then I was discharged to my father's house. When I was discharged, I was not completely independent. I required help for everything: getting out of bed, rolling over in the bed, showering, getting dressed, food preparation, and more. I had an aide 7 days a week for 4 hours, 2 hours in the morning and 2 in the evening, which was not enough. No one explained to me how the extent of my injuries required such a different level of care. And I was unaware of the different doctors that I needed, and I was left to figure those things out on my own. My medical equipment was flimsy, and it was not sustainable. Even with a personal care aid, the devices still weren't sturdy, so I resorted to using sponge baths and disposable pads for bathroom use. I was not given information on how to care for my urological health, and after a few months, I got a urinary tract infection, which led to hospitalization. After being hospitalized for a month, I went into a nursing home where I learned how to be independent. I experienced prejudice there as well, but by that time, I had become immune to it, sadly. But I learned that it wasn't my job to educate ignorance. A little while after that, I was able to get my own apartment where I was on Social Security. I qualified for subsidized housing, and so I moved into a high-rise, and I began college where my funds were monitored, and college loans, which I'm currently paying back now, were considered income. So that completely changed my cost of living. Thank you. That completely changed my cost of living. But I did receive a bachelor's in psychology and philosophy and world religion, and I also have a master's degree in social work. And just last year, I completed my master's in theology. Currently, I continue to face challenges in the medical field: neglect, doctors not listening, and bias. And I continue to receive aid services to assist with daily tasks and range of motion. But despite those things, I currently own my own business. I'm a mental health therapist. I specialize in grief, loss, and trauma. And I believe that I'm gifted in those areas, not just because I'm astute, but because I'm one who is acquainted with the night. I serve on the board of Rochester Spinal Cord Association. I'm the author of Dance Again, A Journey of Inner Healing. And I started by introducing myself with my name. I'd like to tell you what my name means. Nicole means victor of the people. Neighbors means prophet of light. The Greek associated light with knowledge, and the Romans believed that light was referred to as power. The Hebrews associated light with divinity. And so I stand here today not as a victim, but a victor, a woman who was victimized, but I did not stay there. I was chosen to come before you today to shed knowledge and hopefully provide insight and understanding about a demographic who are often overlooked. I believe we cannot control what happens to us, but we can help one another make things easier and more pleasant in this life. And so I hope that the power of these stories motivates you to do so. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ms. Neighbors. Now we're going to turn to Mr. Molina, if you can begin.
Thank you. First, I want to thank the commissioners for inviting me here. Hello, my name is Demetrius Molina. I want to first introduce myself by telling you all a little about who I am, where I come from, and why I was invited here today. I was born in a small city in upstate New York, a place best known for its maximum security prison and its high crime rate. The small city has had a terrible drug problem since the early 80s. Its reputation as a money town attracts big city drug dealers looking to make a larger profit. As a result, substance abuse and gun violence became a serious threat to the safety and the welfare of the community. When I was born, my dad was a 16-year-old who had already been arrested and was well on his way to his first of many prison stints, despite the fact that he was very much legally a child. My mother was also a teen mom and became a 16-year-old single mother forced to drop out of high school. My father fell victim to drug abuse and stayed out of the picture most of my life. After my father went away to prison, my mother shortly fell in love with another man. He was in the picture briefly before being arrested and sentenced to an 8-year prison sentence, leaving my mother yet pregnant and single again. When I was 8 years old, I experienced early childhood abuse at the hands of my mother's younger brother. My uncle regularly took me to the park under the guise of spending time with me and forced me to fight other kids my age. He pitted me against some of my friends' younger brothers. They bet and wagered many of the fights. Due to the high stakes, my uncle placed extreme pressure on me to win these playground scuffles. When I lost, I became the target of his anger and ridicule. If I won, he rewarded me with Burger King. Of course, this was a big secret to my mom. He made me lie about everything we did. Even the cuts and bruises had a premeditated story to be told if my mom questioned me. This went on for quite some time. Looking back on that experience today, it's clear that this had a detrimental impact on my development as a child. I was not only taught to lie and be violent, but hurting other people was a good thing. I've been arrested 5 times in my life. The first time I was arrested, I was 12 years old, a child. One day after school, I punched another child for stealing my bike the previous day. The next day when I reported back to school, I was pulled out of class and taken to the principal's office where I was arrested in front of my mom. When I told them that Brian stole my bike, the cop said, "You should have called the police." But why would I call the police when they took my father away? Why would I call the police when I never considered them people who protected me? Why would I call them when I was taught not to trust the police because they tended to bring more trouble into my neighborhood than solved? The officers didn't care what was taken from me. No one spoke to me or tried to teach me about a better solution. The police only seemed concerned with giving me a criminal record. And this was well before I heard of the school-to-prison pipeline, and it shaped my undeveloped mind to never place trust in this justice system. By the time I was 15, most of my friends either bought or sold drugs. With no father figure or any positive male role models to look up to for guidance, I became easily influenced by the wrong crowd. My environment had a negative effect on my decision-making abilities. Constant exposure to illegal activities desensitized me to crime and violence, which contributed to me idolizing drug dealers from my neighborhood. In hindsight, it was never a question of if I would sell drugs, but more of a question of when I would. My 4th arrest was for retaliating against someone who came shooting at my house. This arrest was my first that involved the use of a weapon. The initiator was not arrested because I would not cooperate with the police by identifying the shooter. Now, most of you may question why I chose not to cooperate with the authorities when someone tried to kill me. Well, the answer is simple and has everything to do with the strained relationship between law enforcement and people from inner city communities. People from these communities do not look at police officers as people who are really there to protect and serve. With over-policing, police discrimination, and police brutality being real threats to minorities, the police are feared and perceived as the enemy. Furthermore, there is culturally a negative stigma associated with cooperating with law enforcement. To be labeled a rat or a snitch in poor communities can be dangerous and sometimes even deadly. This reluctance to cooperate with law enforcement only perpetuates the strained relationship between them and members of minority communities. Though I was clearly headed down the wrong path, the only solution that was ever presented to me was a criminal justice system, not counseling or mentoring or any other community resources. My last arrest resulted from the shooting death of an innocent bystander who was safely sleeping in the comfort of his home when a stray bullet came through his bedroom, killing him while he was asleep. He was a pastor, a father, and a husband, and his wife was 7 months pregnant at the time. My punishment was a 17-to-life year prison sentence and a lifetime of guilt. At the lowest point in my life, I was forced to look in the mirror and did not like my reflection. When did I become a violent criminal? There I was, repeating history, 23 years old, abandoning my son and forcing his mother into a role of a single mother, a product of my own environment, inevitably providing the same disadvantages for my son to continue the cycle. While I was incarcerated, I saw that so many other incarcerated people was like me. They came from child environments where it seems like their destiny is already determined. Recently, I read somewhere that trauma explains behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. I agree, and therefore I do not intend to diminish the gravity of my irresponsible actions by highlighting my hardships. I'm fully aware of the negative impact crime and violence have had on society, as well as the tremendous pain and suffering I have caused due to my extremely poor choices. I only want you to know that I had very few choices in front of me. Not that I chose wrong from all possibilities that children coming from rich households had. The isolation and separation of prison allowed me to feel once again victimized by a punitive system. However, as the years passed and the outward impact of my role in this crime took hold of my conscience, I could no longer feel sorry for myself. Slowly but surely, my sentiments shifted towards those that my actions affected most, my victim and his family. I used my prison time to recognize where my poor choices started and focus on making the necessary changes to have a positive impact on my son. My first step in bettering myself was taking full responsibility for my actions. Avoiding conflict in an extremely violent and volatile place is nearly impossible. Violence is the only form of respect in a place that has daily fightings and stabbings. I witnessed gang wars, riots, violence from guards against incarcerated people. I was exposed to pepper spray, tear gas, and even live rounds being shot in a recreation yard. Incarceration is not the solution. Consider this. Most incarcerated people will be returning to the same communities they were arrested in, now more prone to violence, and facing many challenges of a person with a criminal background. What is the answer? Unfortunately, it's very rarely the prison system itself. The prison system only provides violence, intimidation, fear, and dehumanization. Community groups have to come in and offer restorative approaches because prison does not offer them. I participated in a prison college program and also a prison theater program, and I truly believe that these programs are the reason I made it out of prison as the man I am today. But it's important to distinguish that I made it through prison not because of programs created by the prison, but in spite of the lack of programs provided to incarcerated people by the prison. Prison staff routinely work to obstruct volunteer programs. Prison staff openly mocked, punished, and made it harder for people to access and be successful in education programs from outside community groups. Threats ranging from planting drugs or weapons in your cell to leaving your name off of the class roster were often used to deter incarcerated people from participating in programs that could positively impact our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Molina. Ms. Hawkins, you can proceed.
Today, I stand before you to share a deeply personal and life-altering experience. It was December the 6th, 1995, a day forever etched in my memory, the day my life changed forever. On that day, fateful day, my only child, Reginald, was murdered, and my world was turned upside down. From that moment, my life took a tragic turn. Reggie, the love of my life, my only child, had been taken from me in the most horrific manner imaginable. My world crumbled around me, and I was left profound emptiness in my heart. The pain of losing a child to such a senseless violence is undescribable. The journey of grief has been long, and even after all these years, it's continued. But I share my story not just to recount my own tragedy, but to remind us that the impact of murder reaches far beyond the immediate family. It touches families, friends, and entire communities, leaving us scarred forever. In memory of Reggie, I strive to find strength in his spirit, remembering the joy and laughter he brought into our lives. And I also seek to honor his memory by raising awareness about the need for support for Black and brown families. Also, in the face of losing Reginald, my life, I had to make a critical life decision. Would I wilt as a flower choked in a garden of weeds, or will I fight with every fiber in my soul to decide? So I decided to dedicate my life to try to help those who are unable to help themselves. The reason I'm here today is that I chose to fight back, not for vengeance, because that belongs to the Lord, but as a voice for justice, not only for my son Reginald and my sister Linda, who unfortunately was murdered March the 14th, 2011, but also for every victim that falls prey to violence in their families, their friends and families they leave behind. First, in 1995, we had over 800 homicides in LA. The lack of trust I felt in December 1995 after the murder of my son in the criminal justice system was deeply rooted in historical and contemporary facts. There were two things that were a problem. First, there was a guy named Rodney King who was killed in 1992 in L.A. At that time, it was called police brutality and racial tension led to a perception of systematic racism. Second, the O.J. Simpson case in 1995. My son is murdered in December. O.J. Simpson is sentenced in September or October. It highlighted the racial dynamics in the criminal justice system. It also intensified skepticism about the fairness of the justice system because what we were seeing. To me, the effect of these two events had a lot to do with my son's investigation. There was deep-rooted mistrust within the criminal justice system and the community, making it more difficult for law enforcement to solve black and brown murders in the 90s. The majority of the black and brown murders dating back to the 90s in Los Angeles County remain unsolved. Per a former LAPD chief of police, Chief Willie Williams, a murderer kills in LA County 2 to 3 times before being arrested if you're black or brown. That was in the 90s. Let's talk about 2023. Now I have a dynamic relationship with the criminal justice systems. Our story is used to collaborate, a model in Los Angeles for building trust and addressing the issues faced by black and brown. But we still face challenges. To me, black and brown communities in LA County, like in many other minority communities, often face unique and disappropriate challenges when dealing with murder and its aftermath. First, in black and brown community, murder is justified by the criminal justice system by blaming the victim. Second, in telling us to give those who murder our loved ones a second chance. What about our children? What about us? We face challenges. Lack of attention is not given. Majority of our cases go unsolved. We have lack of resources in black community, economic disparity, distrust of the criminal justice system, and it's a biased investigation. We are stereotyped, for instance, derogatory name calling you're giving to witnesses in our community, snitches and thugs and whistleblowing from the criminal justice system, labeling young black and brown murdered victims as gangbangers, drug addicts, drug dealers based on their zip code and association as though it's justifying them being murdered. These labelings not only perpetuate stereotype but also affects how murder victims' families from these communities are perceived and treated in the criminal justice system. Negative terminology. The use of negative terminology, calling these murder victims gangbangers and drug dealers, describe murder victims not only dehumanizes our murder victims, but also perpetuates a cycle of victim blaming. It is crucial to treat all victims with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. To me, personally, these issues undermine the pursuit of justice and further erode trust in the criminal justice system for black and brown. Victim blaming. To be labeling, calling them gangbangers, drug dealers, or witnesses with derogatory terms not only adds to their suffering, but also perpetuates a cycle of stigmatization and discrimination. It is crucial to focus on supporting and understanding the experience of those who have been affected by murder, whether they are victims, witnesses, or their families. Also, it's important for communities, law enforcement, society as a whole to refrain from victim blaming and instead work together to support those who have been affected. We have noticed as black and brown murder victims' families in LA, animals are given more support and attention than our black and brown murder victims. How can we believe in a system that is calling us derogatory names and we still paying taxes? How does murder impact the trust and relationship in the community and law enforcement? It impacts it greatly, because if we have the derogatory name calling coming from law enforcement when they're doing investigations, it's hard for us to believe they're doing a great investigation. If you got your foot on my neck and you're calling my child derogatory names, how can we believe in the criminal justice system? We're hearing it from everywhere. And somebody got to stand up and say, stop victimizing victims. We've had it with this craziness. It's only right. Stop blaming the victim, stop blaming the community, and we expect investigations like it's your child being murdered. Yeah, we shouldn't have to ask this, but we do. We want public service announcements regarding black and brown murder victims like you treat other crime victims. We don't see it. We expect to see it. We want them on the bus stops. We want them in the restrooms because we believe people know who murdered our loved ones besides the perpetrator and our kids. We want to be treated just like other crime victims are treated in this country. And why are we being discriminated because we're black and brown? This is unfair for black and brown murdered victims' families to be treated in this fashion in 2023. That's it for me.
Thank you, Ms. Hawkins. Thank you for that. We're going to turn to Mix Ray. If you would proceed, please.
My name is Audacia Ray, and I'm the Director of Community Organizing and Public Advocacy at the New York City Anti-Violence Project. I'm a bisexual, non-binary, former sex worker, and I'm a survivor of intimate partner and sexual violence, and my pronouns are they and she. Today I'm going to be sharing about some of the cases that the Anti-Violence Project has worked on and some of the families that we've worked closely with. But first I'll talk a little bit about how AVP works. The Anti-Violence Project, which was founded in 1980, is the only LGBT-specific victim services agency in New York City, and it's the largest organization in the country that's dedicated exclusively to working with LGBTQ and HIV-affected survivors of all forms of violence, and we take a special focus on intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and hate violence. AVP coordinates the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, or NCAVP, the New York State LGBTQ Intimate Partner Violence Network, and we are a partner in the FIPSA-funded National LGBTQ Intimate Partner Violence Institute. We operate a 24/7 English-Spanish hotline for survivors, and we provide free legal counseling and advocacy services. In NCVP's 2018 report on anti-LGBTQ violence, we documented that people of color and transgender or gender nonconforming people were most often victims of hate violence homicides, with 71% of the victims being people of color, 52% were trans and gender nonconforming people, and 40% were specifically transgender women of color. To get a more complete picture of the disproportionate impacts on violent crime on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, data must be collected to reflect multiple marginalization around race and sex, and UCCCHR's categories must be expanded to include sexual orientation as well as gender identity and presentation. The FBI has this extremely underutilized category of multiple bias for hate crimes, but their assessment tools have to be sharpened to recognize the crimes closer to the frequency that they're actually happening. In the 2022 crime data that the FBI recently released for nationwide, it determined that there had been more than 11,000 single bias hate crimes, but only 346 multiple bias hate crime incidents. Considering multiply marginalized identities is really key to understanding and responding to what's going on along the lines of race and sex. And when hate crimes are documented as anti-Black violence by the FBI, the sex of the victim is also documented. And when hate crimes are documented as anti-sexual orientation, the sex and race of the victim are documented. But this demographic information is not considered holistically and intersectionally, and it has to be. I want to share the story of DeAndre Matthews, a 19-year-old Black cisgender gay man from Brooklyn who borrowed his mom's Jeep one night this past February, and he didn't come home. DeAndre's body was found the next day on train tracks near Brooklyn College. He had a gunshot wound in his head, and his body had significant burn wounds. His mother's Jeep was found burnt out nearby, and later a medical examiner found that he had suffered from smoke inhalation prior to his death. In collaboration with the Matthews family, AVP organized a vigil for DeAndre on February 16th, which was 9 days after his body was found. The event at the Brooklyn Community Pride Center was standing room only, and alongside DeAndre's mother, Danielle, we made a plea for the horrific crime to be investigated as a hate crime. In the following weeks and months, it became clear that DeAndre knew his attacker. They had been in communication for more than a year, and on DeAndre's phone there were multiple pictures of them together. And the 19-year-old man who was arrested in May was charged with murder, weapons possession, and evidence tampering. DeAndre's murder was not charged as a hate crime because it didn't meet the standard of hateful intent nor explicit expression of anti-Black or anti-gay hate during the crime itself. In New York, racist, anti-sexual orientation, and anti-gender identity violence are hate crimes, and they're documented in the annual FBI statistics. For the purpose of this briefing, I want to underscore that there are gaps among how the FBI categorizes these incidents, state laws around inclusivity and discrimination categories, and the limited discrimination categories of sex and race that the Commission uses. As we've learned more about the circumstances of DeAndre's homicide, EVP has been highlighting the complex intersections of hate violence, intimate partner violence, and hookup violence that were present in this crime. That analysis, however, is not at all present in the data or in the charges around the case. The second example I want to share with you today is a pattern of 5 homicides in Jacksonville, Florida during 2018. All of the victims were women who were both Black and trans, and all of them were victims of gun violence. It's important to say their names: Antasha English, Catalina Christina James, Celine Walker, Jessie Sumlar, Sasha Gardens. Although 5 murders is a significant pattern, and the local community expressed concern about the possibility of a serial killer, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Department was very lax in their investigations and in communicating publicly about the cases. Several of the homicide victims were misgendered and dead named in the press, which delayed the process of identifying them and connecting with loved ones. Trans people don't often share their legal or dead names, even with close friends. So when they're reported as missing under their known name but documented by police or coroners under their dead names, their loved ones don't know what happened to them. Because law enforcement officials were not trans competent, the investigation slowed and the community became even more distrustful of the police. And while it's necessary for police to be trans competent and affirming, it's even more important for there to be substantial support for community reporting mechanisms that do not involve law enforcement. As reported in Lambda Legal's 2023 publication, Protected and Served, Black participants had contact with the police in the previous 5 years at rates 18% higher than non-Black respondents, and 36% of Black participants did not trust the police at all, and this is specifically folks who are Black and LGBTQ. To get a more complete picture of the disproportionate impacts of violent crime on Black people, data must be collected in a way that reflects the multiple marginalization around race and sex, and the categories have to be expanded to include sexual orientation, as well as gender identity and presentation. Because of the mistrust and the fear that many Black and multiply marginalized people have towards law enforcement, community-based reporting can assist in collecting more accurate data that reflects not just who feels comfortable reporting to the police, but more expansively who's actually experiencing violence. Black people have consistently represented over 82% of non-white victims of all reported violence from 2017 to 2022. And over these 5 years, anti-Black hate violence increased 66%, while hate violence increased by 58%. The only population experiencing harm at a faster pace are people of LGBTQ identities, and there's a significant crossover between those communities. For sexual orientation and gender identity-based violence, the increase from 2017 to 2022 was over 90%. Year to year, hate violence continues to climb with disproportionate rates targeting race and ethnicity, and also demographics correlating with sexual orientation and gender identity. Without a concerted effort to reduce hate violence and to document the multiple bias incidents, individuals who are at the intersection of race, sexual orientation, and gender identity will continue to be overrepresented in violent victimization reporting, and with significant risks of these surges continuing to trend. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ray. Now we're going to turn to Ms. Hillard. If you can proceed.
Good afternoon. My name is Tashika Hilliard. I'm a newly licensed nurse, mother of 3, and sadly the widow of Glenn Hilliard, who was murdered. Today I'm here to speak about my husband, Wycomico County Deputy Sheriff Glenn Hilliard, who was brutally murdered while on duty on June 12, 2022. Had former Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby held violent criminals accountable, my husband may still be alive today. Glenn was adopted at the age of 4 years old and raised in Newark, New Jersey. As a child, Glenn was fascinated by and often drawn to anything law enforcement related. During his senior year of high school, Glenn visited and toured the campus of the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, a historically black university. Glenn told me that when he first saw the campus, he fell in love with the quiet area as it was a far cry from the hustle and bustle of high crime rates associated with Newark. Before becoming a deputy sheriff, Glenn worked as a seasonal police officer in Ocean City, Maryland during the summer of his first year of college. Glenn told me that when he worked in the seasonal position, he knew for sure that law enforcement was his #1 career choice. Glenn changed his major from computer science and graduated with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice in the winter of 2003. During college, Glenn also worked in student security and had the opportunity to meet with and form relationships with local law enforcement officers. Because of those relationships and his character, Glenn was offered a position at the local police department, which he accepted. Glenn then enrolled and completed his formal police training at a local community college. Glenn worked as a police officer at a couple of different small agencies before he was sworn in as deputy sheriff at Wycomico County Sheriff's Office in 2012. Glenn was never shy about his many accomplishments and certifications throughout his career, with advancing to the SWAT team being at the top of his list. Anyone who ever met or worked with Glenn knew that he was born to be a law enforcement officer. He was excellent at his job, and he loved every minute of it. June 12, 2022 was a Sunday. As Glenn got ready for work, to leave for work, I gave him a kiss and told him to come back safely, as I always did. He replied, "I shoot first," as he always did, as he walked out the door. A few hours later, I text Glenn, and he responded with, "I will call you when I clear this call." Nothing unusual about that, except that night he never did get the chance to call me back. As I mentioned before, Glenn was extremely great at his job, and he was most proud when he was able to serve a warrant, especially on someone who may be a danger to the community. So on the evening of June 12, 2022, when Glenn heard the call that a convicted felon with an active fugitive warrant, who may also be armed, was nearby his location, he immediately began searching. Because Glenn was so good at what he did, it did not take him long to spot and begin pursuit of the suspect. Glenn spotted the suspect peeking out from under the stairwell at the apartment complex. Glenn got out of his car and yelled for the suspect to stop. Unbeknownst to Glenn, the suspect had spotted him first and was lying in wait, fully armed, ready, and disgustingly excited to take a life. Glenn announced himself, and the suspect started running, and my husband took chase. During the very short chase, Glenn announced that his taser was drawn and would be deployed if the suspect did not surrender. Then the suspect, who had a backpack over his shoulder, only took a few more steps before reaching into his backpack and produced a 9mm handgun equipped with laser sight with 30 rounds magazine, fully loaded magazine, and shot my husband 3 times. One round hit Glenn's shoulder, the other hit Glenn in the forehead. As I recall, the medical examiner described it as instantly fatal shot. The suspect, a 20-year-old white male, had been arrested 20 times as a juvenile and now 10 times as an adult. Within his short time of being an adult, the suspect had already had multiple incidences of robbery, second-degree assault, malicious destruction of property, and the list goes on. In 2019, he was facing up to 25-year prison sentence due to the use of a handgun during an armed robbery. The Baltimore City State's attorney authorized for the suspect to receive probation before judgment and not the minimum sentence, after pleading guilty to 1 count of armed robbery. The suspect continued to be arrested throughout different counties in Maryland, but his probation was never violated until sometime in May or early June. The suspect was prohibited from having a firearm, possessing a firearm, due to his prior felony convictions. But as Glenn always told me, gun laws are for law-abiding citizens, not criminals. The only thing that could have saved my husband's life that night would have been if the suspect were in prison where he belonged. I was raised in a household that saw no color, and I was taught to believe we are all just people, children of God. So it was not until I began my career at our local courthouse, working with criminals not unlike the suspect, that I started to become aware that sometimes preconceptions preceded sentences. The suspect fit the demographic of clients that I often work with in a jail diversion program: white, early 20s, not the best childhood, and seemingly needing direction. Unfortunately, throughout my career, I noticed that young black males with the same circumstances were often labeled as violent or drug dealers. It's unfortunate to say, but after finding out about the suspect's identity and history, I had to wonder if the state's attorney in Baltimore decided that this was a poor young white kid who clearly did violent actions, but somehow deserved multiple chances to actually prove he was violent. I thought that if this had been a young black male, would the sentence have been the same, or would the kid have still been sitting in prison and my husband may still be alive today? If it was that the state's attorney was giving him an opportunity to prove himself, then unfortunately he did just that and proved himself to be a violent, heartless murderer of whom the court should be protecting us from and not letting out on the streets. The murderer was eventually captured, tried, and convicted this past June and sentenced to life plus 66 years. I feel that if the state's attorney had been more proactive and allowed prosecutors to violate the suspect's probation and put him in jail, my husband may still be alive today. My husband, love of my life, and children's father is gone, but he died doing what he loved, and he died a hero. Although my children will be facing endless life events without their father, they are comforted in knowing that he did everything right on the night of his murder, and he lost his life, saving the lives of countless others. Thank you for the opportunity to talk today.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Ms. Hilliard. We're going to turn to our final panelist, Christina Love. Whenever you're ready, we can take a moment.
It's a lot. Koyana Gunishjish Hawa. My name is Christina Love. I'm an Igigik Village tribal member. I've traveled very, very far to be here today. My family's from Igigik Village, where we have been for 10,000 plus years. I was raised in the village of Chitna in the interior on Atna land, and today I live on Tlingit Ani, home to the Ak and Taku-Kwan of the Tlingit Nation, also known as Juneau, Alaska. I'm very, very grateful to be here. It's a miracle that I'm here. I know that you're all aware of the statistics of violence, that Native people are more likely to be murdered, to be physically abused or sexually abused than we are to own land, to graduate from college, or to be here today. I'm a senior specialist on intersectionality, and that just means that we can't talk about domestic violence and sexual assault without talking about incarceration and homelessness and substance use. A big part of my job is to normalize the ways that people survive and to place the blame where it belongs. Mental health and substance use are natural reactions to violence. It's the violence that is not the natural thing. I want to tell a couple of stories, and I know that there's the stories that I provided for you, but I want to highlight a couple of other things that are not in the brief. 15 years ago, my body was left in a ditch for dead, and I draw on this experience often when I think about what it took to climb out of that ditch, covered in my own blood and bruised, and flagging down a person to receive medical care. And that of itself is trauma, but the trauma that I want to highlight is what happened after. That while I was in medical services and interacting with law enforcement and advocates, there continued to be a profound misunderstanding and misconception about who survivors are. People said things like, if I hadn't been addicted, then I wouldn't have been abused, or if I hadn't been in that flop house, then those things would have never happened. And I believed them for a really long time. I believed that I was to blame for the harm that had happened to me. And I believed that it was my fault that I was addicted. But if we rewind back to when I was 12 years old, when my father went to prison for sexually abusing his children, there were no supports then there either, and we were blamed for that harm. And if we rewind back even further to my mother and the harm that she experienced while in BAA school, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. My mother is a boarding school survivor, and that was a very hard decision that our family made, because during the 1970s it was illegal to have a mental health issue, and my mother was born with developmental disabilities, and we could go into about the why of that, because she didn't have the adequate medical care that she needed that could have prevented those things from early on. She has Graves' disease. But her family chose to place her in BAA school so that she wouldn't be taken to Morningside Hospital, because at the time mental health was criminalized. I'm telling you this because, and that wasn't that long ago, we have survivors that went to, I've interviewed survivors of internment camps that are still alive, which is just another word for concentration camps in Alaska. Our villages were removed during war to the land of the Tlingit people where they survived grave physical and sexual abuse. When they were hungry, they were given alcohol. When they were thirsty, they were given alcohol. When they were cold, because they didn't have shelter, they were given alcohol. This is the story of how we got here to today, that we have the systems that we pay for, that this subject is not complicated. What we're talking about is things that were taken from our communities, and the solution is that those things would be brought back. Thousands of years of parenting skills, once they're removed, they don't magically reappear. Violence is a learned behavior, and people who brought people here against their will were the first abusers, and people who violently stole land and violently stole culture were the first abusers. And what we end up with is what we have here today. And so the shorter story is that these are the institutions that we have inherited. These policies and practices we did not write. They were not made for us, and they were not made by us. And so we are all here today, and in preparation, I thought about the thousands of people who've sat in the seat before me, the brilliant scholars of law and survivors and activists who have made the same plea to all of you to do something differently, that this is all of our country. And I believe that we got here because of a dream that wasn't ours. And it will take all of us to have the courage and the determination. I have to believe that even though right now, earlier this week, I was in trial for my own sexual assault. On March 3rd of this year, I celebrated 10 years of recovery from heroin, 10 years of recovery from incarceration, that I learned how to grow back into the community. And I get to be here today because people believed in my worth, because they looked me in the eye and they told me that they didn't think that I was a bad person, that just somebody who had experienced a lot of trauma. And we have the opportunity to tell that story about who people are. And so there's a couple of major solutions that I want to focus on. One of them is what we call equity audits, and that's an opportunity to recenter our services. Law enforcement, everything that law enforcement needs, that medical providers need, advocates need, all survivors need, all of us need. When I go into a sexual assault and I'm working with somebody, there's so often that I'm encountering law enforcement officers and medical officers who have no heart response. And I know that the victim that I'm working with, her and I, we're going to be just fine. But the people that we're encountering who don't have this heart response, who don't have access to medical care, who don't have access to these things, yes, housing would be very, very beneficial, as well as the full continuum of care. And so it will take that infrastructure. Cost-free initiatives include changing the language that we tell the whole story about how we got here, and we get very clear about what those solutions are. That I was not sexually assaulted, that he sexually assaulted me, and that we be very clear about the people who are being harmed, because there is a false dichotomy of us and them and perpetrators. It's not political, that we are not vulnerable people, that we're targeted people, and that's what makes us vulnerable. That on the front page serial killers say that they are going after people that no one looks for, that nobody listens to, and they're right. We have in our communities, 1 out of 3 communities has no response at all. In the report, you'll see that there are several communities, when we call for 911, no one comes. And so we have these entire systems that deem certain groups of people. It's not a coincidence that women are harmed more than men. It's not a coincidence that Black, brown, and indigenous people are harmed more, or that our LGBTQ two-spirit relatives are harmed more. That we have to ask these questions about who's being harmed, as well as the solutions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Love, and thank you to all of our panelists for your testimony and your bravery in sharing your stories with us today. I know I can speak on behalf of my fellow commissioners that we're very touched by your words. At this point, I'm going to open this up to questions, and I believe we still have a few commissioners on the phone, so I'd like to open it up to them first. Is there anyone on the phone that has a question?
Madam Chair, this is Chris now. I don't have any questions.
We'll go with Commissioner Gilchrist and then Commissioner Kirsnow.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Gilchrist here. I don't have any questions, but I certainly just want to thank panelists for those heartfelt remarks today. This testimony certainly, again, informs us about the work that we not only are doing with this particular issue, but how we continue to look at the implications of this work going forward. And so I just want to thank them for coming and sharing with us today during our briefing.
I appreciate that, Commissioner Gilchrist. Commissioner Kirsnow?
No questions, thank you.
Vice Chair Nurse?
I just want to share my sentiment with you that you all touch me very much. And I've been working on these issues for 30 years, and I've never seen such brave people. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your struggles and your pain with us.
I know.
I echo the sentiments.
Yeah, I echo it as well. I know that a few of you weren't here earlier this morning, but I want to point out that we heard from experts this morning about different issues that have contributed different highlights in terms of care after victimization, including victim services, issues with even having access. I was surprised to learn, I'm from Texas, and I was very surprised to learn that our victims compensation program, although women are more likely to apply for compensation, are less likely to receive it. So I just want to point out that, we've heard from these panelists that are identified all of the things that you all spoke about. And so I just wanted to pose a general question of what you feel, what you feel is the most needed in terms of addressing the issues that each of you faced. We could start with Ms. Neighbors if you have any thoughts there.
Thank you so much. That's a big question. I think in education, I think is important. Really getting some cultural sensitivity courses for the medical field. I think that would be really important. Education about crime victim services. I was really blessed. Like I said, my injury happened 17 years ago, so I was able to stay in the hospital for 4.5 months. Now, people are shot and they're sent home in 2 weeks. I couldn't imagine what that would be like. And they're sent back to the same environment, so it's not accessible. They can't use the bathroom, anything like that. And they're not told about crime victims, which is a federally funded service, and every state doesn't have it, but in New York State, that will pay for anything dealing with your injury. A lot of people don't have that knowledge, or they're not provided with a social worker to help fill out that information. So I would say crime victims and cultural sensitivity. I actually work on that on a small scale in Rochester, New York, with Rochester Spinal Association. We have clinics for the residents and the doctors to come in, and we share our experience, and we talk about statistics of what's going on to hopefully bring about change, but that's on a very small scale in comparison to the nation. So that would be my thoughts. Thank you.
If anyone else would like to share something.
Yes. I believe that the biggest issue is the strained relationship between law enforcement and members of inner city communities. And the reason that is because, from my experience, not having trust in law enforcement and not really believing that they were there to help and protect caused me to do things that led to the path that I took. And also, like, the police officers and things not having really much experience or knowledge with dealing with people in the inner city communities. Most of the presence always resulted in, they're responding to a crime or something that happened and someone's being arrested. So if there was some sort of programs that can kind of, bridge the gap between the inner city communities and law enforcement, I believe that the strained relationship could be strengthened and create trust. This lack of trust is what led to a lot of issues.
Thank you for that. Ms. Love?
Thank you so much for asking the question. What I've learned with looking at other solutions is that we can't change public policy without public opinion. We've written beautiful omnibus crime bills that people didn't understand. They didn't understand the science of addiction. They didn't understand the science of trauma. They don't understand. I think that often when we look at the full continuum of what communities need and the very limited options, then we end up in this cycle of over-criminalization. There are entire states that would collapse without the economic benefits of what is slave labor and how that contributes to increased violence within those communities. So first, I would ask for an equity audit that centers people who have been directly impacted. I heard somebody quote Glenn Martin, and the other part of that quote was really important. So the quote is, the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but furthest from resources and power. Myself and other people here, we have all the solutions, but we've never had access to the social capital. We've never had access to the power or the resources to make those changes. We can tell you that economic instability and that housing and employment, that all of those things that people need, those basic needs. When we look at the hierarchy of need, formerly known as Maslow's, was stolen from the Blackfeet Nation. The other part of that that's missing is the community context. And that there isn't anything wrong with people or communities. There are only things that are missing. And for some people and for some communities, those are big things. And for some people and for some communities, those are things that have been missing, or sorry, let me rephrase that. The other part of this is language, things that were taken. I didn't lose my language or my culture, they were taken from us. So engaging in this process that allows, it's a paradigm shift that would restore power to communities and people who have been directly impacted at every single level. So hiring people with lived experience, bringing people in with lived experience to do these equity audits that includes language, using the right language, people who perpetrate harm, right? So then we get rid of that false dichotomy of who is committing harm, and we name them as people first, and we tell the whole story about what addiction really is and what's happening to this community. That's real liberation, when you know that you've been living life in a certain way because you didn't have access to other. Maya Angelou's another way. We do the best we can until we know another way. And so it takes all of us to tell the whole story and ensure that people have what they need, because when we do, myself and others are the example of that. When we're given the resources, that we choose something differently. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hawkins, were you wanting to?
No, you can go first.
I think it just started with education. With the criminal justice system, needs to be educated on culture sensitivity when it comes to black and brown murdered victims, because there is no training on that. And by it not being trained in 2023, it puts us further and further back. It has to start at the top. We hear on TV, even from Congress and Senate, they calling victims whistleblowers and these derogatory names. It has to stop. It has to stop from the top, and then demand that law enforcement, the judges, the DA, the public defenders do not use these derogatory name calling when it comes to murdered victims. We did it when it came to rape with women who walked the street. It became a law that because I'm a prostitute, you couldn't call me a prostitute when I came to a rape case in the courtroom. We need that to happen for murder victims. The derogatory name calling of murder victims and witnesses. And that's a problem in our community, because if you come forward, like you said, you've been called a snitch, a sellout, and then they got these things, snitches get stitches. And so we have to change that whole, you got to change it. And you all have the power and the resources that we don't have in our community, as she indicated. We don't have it. And for us to be in 2023, there's not one public service announcement in this country regarding murder. That's unacceptable.
Thank you.
I'm thinking a little bit about a question actually that Commissioner Jones asked on an earlier panel about the gap between communities doing things for themselves and what we require from the federal government. And I think what's coming up really strongly in this panel is that we need both. We need the investment of federal government, and we also need support for our communities, because our communities know what we need, and we know how to get there, and we must be treated as experts, not just on our lives. I always love panels of survivors. It's always the best part of any hearing. And also, we're all folks who have solutions that are not just here to tell a painful personal story. We have, through our lives, have understood like what needs to shift in order for that to work. And part of that also requires folks from our communities being included in those policy conversations. Policy conversations are not over our heads. And if they are, it's because they're being put together in a very obtuse way. So we can engage in those conversations, and we should be at those tables, not just to tell sad stories, but also to really be invested in ourselves and invest in how do we shift this together.
Would anyone else like to make a comment? Okay. No, you're okay. You don't have to. I'm not going to call on anyone. I just want to make sure I give everyone the opportunity to say what they want to say. So, well, I'm hearing no more questions at this point, and I just, from the bottom of my heart, I'm so grateful and thankful for your presence here today. I know you traveled very far, Ms. Love, Ms. Hilliard. I know a lot of folks, Mr. Molina. I appreciate you coming here today, sharing your stories, and participating in this important panel. We're gonna incorporate a lot of what we've heard today into the ultimate report that we'll produce. So thank you again very much.
Can I just echo that? Thank you. I mean, and I give you my personal assurance that everything that you have said, I have been listening and taking notes constantly and hearing your stories. And as I'm on this commission, we will work very hard to figure out the issues that we can do with this government to bring healing and justice for these issues that you all have raised. Thank you.
Thank you. We're gonna go ahead and take a break, a 10-minute break. We'll reconvene at 2:06 p.m. for our fourth and final panel.